Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short, and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
welcome to 2025, dear listener. Happy New Year. We are back from the holidays just in time for the inauguration, or I suppose re-inauguration of Donald Trump. This is sure to have significant implications for U.S. foreign policy broadly, but specifically for how we approach the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia more broadly. This is a new season of the Bear Market Brief. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. On this episode, we'll be investigating the state of U.S. foreign policy orthodoxy and where the U.S. finds itself in the world with Donald Trump soon to reassume office. How is policy towards the Ukraine war and Russia shaping up so far? Do we have any insights? My guest this episode certainly does. Rejoining the Bear Market Brief podcast is Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a historian of U.S. foreign policy and analyzes contemporary problems in American strategy and diplomacy. He is the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, which reveals how U.S. leaders in World War II decided to pursue global military dominance as an effectively perpetual project. He has recently taught at Catholic University, Princeton University, and Yale Law School. I really enjoy episodes where I get to learn a lot during my conversation, and this was certainly one of them. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Bear Market Brief podcast. It is great to have you with us. Let's start with our traditional question one. Could you remind the listeners a bit about your affiliation and what's keeping you busy these days?
Oh, well, I am a senior fellow in the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's a program that's basically spanned the course of the Biden administration, which we'll be talking about. So it's a relatively new program in what I think is fairly called the oldest foreign policy think tank in the United States. I'm a historian by training, and these days I try to apply my training in U.S. history and U.S. foreign policy to contemporary issues, although sometimes in some ways my views start to become untethered from my training and are grounded in what I see around me, which makes me very uncomfortable because I still like to maintain my base of knowledge and in all that extensive training that I got while I made very, very little money. In fact, I think I lost money.
Well, I think you're great guest to talk about some of the issues today, which will be focused on what is coming to an end with the Biden presidency and what is going to be starting around inauguration, I guess, in a couple weeks now with the Trump administration 2.0.
My
hoping
friend,
to talk.
It's 1 week.
1 week. Oh, well,
yes.
That's the holiday. That's the holiday.
Accommodate yourself to that reality.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about, first, I think what's coming to a close, and this is a Russia podcast, but I think we'll be exploring American foreign policy broadly and understanding the limitations of policy making as a whole, institutionally or otherwise, because that has impacts for Russia. So not everything we talk about today will be Russia, but I think helpful to understand these issues because they will have the material impact on our stomping grounds territorially and subject matter wise for this podcast. So as Biden's term comes to a close, what is your sense of his Russia policy? I mean, last we talked, we were figuring out how the U.S. might approach Ukraine. Do you have a broader sense of what we were actually trying to accomplish?
So I agree with, I think, the subtext of your question, which is that it's not so easy to say at this point. So I think we can identify 3 phases of the Biden administration's Russia policy. Phase one, easy to forget now, was the pursuit of what several officials called a stable and predictable relationship with Moscow. That included, a summit between Biden and Putin in the summer of 2021, which is, somewhat notable given the way that Democrats had expressed so many concerns over the Trump years about Russia policy under Trump. But I think that in phase one, the Biden administration was looking to sort of park the Russia problem in the service of being able to focus on strategic competition with China centering on the Indo-Pacific, and wasn't willing to offer Russia dramatic U.S. policy changes in order to bring about the hoped for stable and predictable relationship. So we know how that ended up. And that gets us to phase two as the administration anticipated Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine happening. And that it indeed transpired in February 2022. I think the administration's policy here is fairly clear. And the administration laid it out in the opening months of the conflict. And that was to, first of all, avoid a direct NATO-Russia war. Secondly, keep Ukraine alive while avoiding a war, preserve its sovereignty and independence, and to a lesser and questionable degree, its territorial integrity. And on top of that, there was a formulation in the administration of dealing Russia a strategic failure. I think that's the most precise way I've heard it put. And that meant making it evident that Russia would not benefit overall from its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That did not mean necessarily dealing Russia a total defeat on the battlefield, but it meant making Russia's war sufficiently costly for Russia that other countries would look at what happened and conclude there's a real price for doing the kind of thing that Russia did to Ukraine. So, as part of dealing Russia a strategic failure, the administration helped to bring Sweden and Finland into NATO, obviously imposed sanctions and got many partners to impose sanctions on Russia. So I think that's phase two, right? And phase two, if phase one failed, phase two succeeded, I would say. But it succeeded so well in a sense that it left difficult questions for the rest of the war. Once the war did not end quickly and Ukraine did preserve its sovereignty with U.S. and allied help, that raised the question of what is the United States searching for now? And I think the administration essentially could have chosen to do one of two things. It could have chosen to push for negotiations, or at least lay out some theory of at what point it would be appropriate to try to bring the war to an end, or it could have pursued a Ukrainian victory. Now, that could have been defined in different ways, but the way that most people and Ukraine's government itself have defined it was a total territorial victory, Ukraine taking back all the territory that Russia has come to occupy since February 2022, or perhaps since 2014. And I think that the administration essentially tried to avoid making this choice. In theory, their stated goal from phase two, from the beginning of the war, was that the administration was aiding Ukraine on the battlefield in order to strengthen its hand at the negotiating table, with the expectation that the war would ultimately end through negotiations. And yet, the administration was very differential to Ukraine as to, whether and on what terms to open up negotiations. It didn't have any direct contact with the Russian government with respect to bringing about a ceasefire, so far as we know. At the same time, voices started to make Ukrainian victory the kind of default position. And sometimes President Biden and other senior members of the administration seem to agree with that notion, even if it didn't necessarily mean that the United States was committed to a complete Ukrainian territorial victory. So I think we end up in this murky place as the Biden administration hands the reins over to Team Trump.
Let's talk about this murkiness a little more. I'm going to skip the question order we had chatted about before this episode, rejigger a little bit here, because one of the questions I have comes from a podcast appearance you made on Carnegie Endowment's very own World Unpacked podcast. Can include a link to that great discussion that I think dovetails nicely with what we're talking about here. The term strategic insolvency came up, and I want to ask you about that and basically the question of where is the US in the world as a strategic power as Trump takes the reins again?
So my view is that the US has a real strategic insolvency problem, which means that the commitments that the United States has made, the defense commitments, outstrip the willingness or means of the United States to serve those commitments. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure that everyone in Washington does not agree that the United States faces a strategic insolvency problem. It's particularly unclear whether members of the outgoing Biden administration uh, believe that this is a problem. I think some do and some don't. I did think that many did see a problem in their first year of office, which would imply the problem hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse, I think, pretty clearly over the last 4 years. So that would imply that there would still be a problem. But to say a little bit more about that problem, I think it involves kind of two facets: overcommitment and overstretch. Overcommitment, and this is particularly, I think, applicable to Europe, involves the United States making defense commitments, particularly to the countries that were added into NATO post Cold War, that are not would not be clearly in the U.S. national interest to make good on those commitments, i.e., go to war full scale with Russia if Russia tried to test them. And indeed, as I've written in a recent Financial Times op-ed, if you look at the history of post-Cold War NATO enlargement, particularly after the first round of enlargement, when you get to the most important round, by which 7 countries, including the 3 Baltic republics, were brought into NATO in 2004, it's very clear that American policymakers and senators who had to ratify that change were not thinking in these terms. Well, if we make this commitment, would it actually be in our interest? And do we think we'd be able to politically come to the direct defense of these countries? They thought, to the contrary, that once new countries were brought into the NATO alliance, this problem would never come due because Russia was weak and because why would anyone want to challenge the power of the United States? So I think no one can be quite that blasé today about this problem. And then a distinct problem, but a related one, is overstretch, which focuses on the material resources the United States has to serve its commitments. And I think you see quite a few members of the incoming Trump administration concerned about this, that, even if you think all the U.S. defense commitments are justified, in other words, the United States would have a vital interest in defending all the countries that it's pledged to defend to date, the United States simply doesn't have the resources to do that. And that means that there could be a deterrence failure. So a lot of the objections to U.S. aid to Ukraine, particularly over the last 12 months, have used overstretched type arguments, focusing on, what are we taking away from the defense of Taiwan when we pass more aid to Ukraine. I myself am not. I think there's some validity to those arguments. I'm not as concerned about a near-term Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but I do think that in the more grand strategic sense, the U.S. does face a big overstretch problem, and I'm not alone. If you look at people who think the United States very much needs to maintain all its commitments. Many of them, especially in a recent congressional commission, say the United States needs to spend way more on its military in order to provide for its deterrence obligations.
So to address, I guess this is a good question, strategic insolvency. Well, I don't know if it's a good question. The listeners can decide that. But to address strategic insolvency, so it is a question of either spending more resources or generating more political will versus reducing commitments. Like, what are the paths we could take to address that problem?
So I think if you think the only problem is overstretch, then yes. Yes, the answer is either we spend much more on the military, and we already spend, upwards of $1 trillion on national security, which includes the defense budget. So maybe it should be 2 times or 3 times more. Um, and that would mean also um, increasing U.S. Military infrastructure, troop deployments in a number of places. Or we should be looking for ways to reduce those commitments, and that could take the relatively drastic form of ending mutual defense obligations for the United States, or it could take the more gradual form of shifting the burden for defense onto U.S. allies over time. And it's that latter position that I favor. And that position also addresses the problem of overcommitment. So if you think the problem is overcommitment, it's still not even good enough to just ramp up U.S. military spending, supposing that were politically feasible. And I have huge doubts about that. But even if you could succeed wildly in ramping up military spending, sending many more American service members abroad, the question still arises, how would the U.S. actually act if Russia tested NATO in, say, Latvia? Would it, in fact, make sense for the United States to have a full-blown war with Russia? Or would something like a, Ukraine model actually make more sense, perhaps while some European countries were engaged in indirect war with Russian forces. So I think, to my mind, the best answer here is to try to not be beholden to the commitments that prior generations of Americans who faced a very different world and a very different United States have made, and do our best to responsibly shift burdens onto U.S. allies and partners.
I have a political messaging question, not partisan per se, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot after the election, I mean, there were certainly debates about what we should be doing in Ukraine, but it seems one of the lessons of the election, I don't mean to get over my skis or say anything controversial, is that people don't like inflation. Kind of full stop. That more or less was determinative of what happened. For somebody who, for whatever reason, is listening to this podcast while grocery shopping, and regular people with regular problems, what does strategic insolvency or broadly this murky place America is at in the world mean for regular Americans? Is this a question of like the tax burden to support this foreign policy? Like, how might this impact regular people?
So at best, Yes, at a minimum, you know, the United States routinely spends more than half of its federal discretionary budget on defense. So if you want to cut US federal spending or rein it in to ignore defense spending, or in fact see defense spending substantially increase, that's a big problem. But at worst, US strategic insolvency means that one of our many adversaries and increasingly aligned adversaries may test a US defense obligation because they do the math and they think, actually, uh, we don't think the United States would be able to defeat us in a conflict. And it means average Americans may be on the hook for going to war with Russia or China. Um, and, we can talk about uh, the implications of that, but they would be profound. And it's even hard, I think, for our society to envision what a full scale war with either one of those countries, particularly China, how it would affect us. And truly uncertain how our society would behave, because Americans haven't paid these kinds of enormous costs for foreign policy choices in like a concentrated way. We could argue about the war on terror. There were big costs, but they were spread out and they were put on the national credit card, et cetera. That hasn't really happened since the Vietnam War. And in fact, a U.S.-China war uh, will be more high intensity than the war in Vietnam for sure.
For sure. So let's turn to this Trump administration 2.0, as we've covered the place in which we find
Aaron, I have to
ourselves.
insist that we call it Trump 2 because Trump is an analog figure.
No decimals.
No,
No decimals at all.
no 2.0. Trump 2, Roman numerals.
So, I think he would approve of that, like a Roman style. I know he likes columns and traditional looking buildings. He's talked about
Yes,
that, and in addition to many other things on his social media, but we will
yes.
not relitigate those. One of the things I've heard a lot about this new administration is challenging a lot of the orthodoxies that have led to, if you believe in this insolvency problem, have led to this overextension. Um, I don't know if Trump has particularly used this word before, but I've heard people in his circles talk about the foreign policy blob. What is the blob?
I guess these days their term would be deep state or something. Although that doesn't quite capture it, because I think when we talk about blob, we're talking about policymakers and think tankers and media figures, maybe they'd say elites, who have an overall picture of what they want America's role in the world to be. So I think you have seen some people in the incoming administration talk about primacy or liberal hegemony as representing the foreign policy consensus in Washington, that in their view has led us to grief, and that is distinctive to the post-Cold War period. So they're not necessarily critical of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, but it's a specifically post-Cold War critique. The Biden administration's formulation of uh, liberal privacy was that it was defending the quote-unquote rules-based order, which might seem like a commitment to international law and institutions, except that um, for them, the rules-based order included, all U.S. security alliances and partnerships, and therefore it meant, competing robustly with adversaries in maintaining the U.S. position uh, everywhere that it existed, with the notable exception of Afghanistan. So I think that's the way people on the right, but also on the left, see this issue. there's another way in which blob is used, and it's related, but a little bit different. We saw it articulated by President Obama, lest we forget, and his advisor, Ben Rhodes. And the way Obama used the term was to say that the blob had a reflex to use military force to solve all matter of overseas problems, which in turn assumes that the U.S. has a right and responsibility to solve those problems. So that was his criticism of the blob, but it didn't necessarily touch the more structural aspects of, U.S. alliances, U.S. indefinite overseas military deployments that I think have now come to loom larger in the conversation.
So I want to talk about Trump's appointments and statements so far on foreign policy. I think we're seeing a pattern. Maybe I'm wrong that replicates some of what we saw during his first administration. Well, on the campaign trail was very heterodox and made appointments, some controversial ones with very heterodox views. And now, as we are coming closer to inauguration, which, as you correctly point out, is only a week away and not several weeks away. Kind of these more firebrand figures suddenly starting to sound a little more conventional, and views that, hey, we are going to end the war in Ukraine on day one has now, I think as of this week, been extended to, hey, it may take a couple months to end the war in Ukraine. So what is your read on where we're heading in this administration, at least based on appointments, statements, what you're hearing these days? What should we expect in the first couple months?
So I'm not surprised by the shifts that we've seen since Trump's election. He obviously wasn't going to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. And I also think that during the campaign, both he and his political opponents kind of agreed to take his most extreme rhetoric as, evidence of his true intent. It kind of served them both to do that. And so what we're seeing is Trump having to really think about not just what he thinks is a good line and not what just is his intention, but what is the reality of the situation and what are the trade-offs. And so, I think the signals that we've seen so far indicate that Trump would not want to see Ukraine fall completely and have an Afghanistan-like situation there on his watch. He, after all, put the withdrawal from Afghanistan in motion, virtually forced Biden's hand on that issue, and then ended up, lustily attacking Biden for the supposedly incompetent withdrawal from Afghanistan. He can probably see that he would receive the same kinds of criticism if Russian forces were to overrun Ukraine, all of Ukraine, during his administration. So I think what we'll see is, Trump, in many ways, facing the same kinds of challenges that a Biden or Kamala Harris administration would have faced. But I do think, what I think is signal rather than noise from Trump's campaign rhetoric is that he intends to put pressure on both Ukraine and Russia to bring them into negotiations, and he wants to hold negotiations as early as he can. And I suspect that he will also heavily involve himself in the process of negotiations. If you think back to his North Korea summitry with Kim Jong-un, a cautionary tale because it didn't come to much. Trump liked the leader to leader format of those negotiations. Hopefully he will see it in this case that didn't bear fruit, and that he also needs to rely on diplomats to do a lot of spade work, both before and after potential summits. So the other thing I think is notable about this incoming administration, there are people there who have quite different views on what U.S. grand strategy should be. In the first Trump administration, Trump had his own ideas, but then most of his advisors, including his senior advisors, were fairly conventional primacist types, who could have served in other Republican administrations, who might have even served in some Democrat administrations. This time, particularly if you look at the vice president's office or the Defense Department, there are figures who may want the U.S. to pull back substantially from European security, maybe even from the Middle East, though you hear less about that on the campaign trail this time, which is quite notable, because that used to be the center of gravity for all the talk about ending endless war. I think for political reasons. So there is a view in the administration that a pivot to Asia has become a kind of urgent necessity.
But how many decades have we been pivoting to Asia now? Didn't that start in like 2006, 8? This is a long time coming.
Yeah, announced early in the first Obama administration. So you'd be right to say maybe this won't happen. And clearly, I don't see those kinds of views being espoused by the National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State nominee. They seem on the surface to be more primacist types. Then again, we're now in a different situation where the U.S. is more strained in terms of its resources, and our politics have changed. And I think on the right in particular, a pivot to Asia position has more popularity. But I think, I put out with my colleagues a report over the summer on strategic change in U.S. foreign policy. And the fact is, it is just always very difficult to make large-scale change, particularly since the advent of the national security state in and after World War II. And Trump, may want to make significant changes, although he himself seems to be of several different minds about what direction he wants to go in. And so for truly large-scale change to be made, there has to be a, decision at the top that the bureaucracy follows, which is often hard, as Trump learned in his first term. Congress has to at least not try to obstruct those changes, which Congress is often able to do, say on sanctions policy or on defense appropriations, war powers. And then the media political landscape also has to not impose a huge cost on a president for making large changes. And if this isn't a president's priority, and they perceive that there will be a significant cost to them that will come at the expense of their higher priorities, often that can stymie change. The Trump administration has only 4 years to make changes. So you put those things together, including the fact that Trump's senior advisors, at least his initial round, will have major differences on policy issues, I think. I think it should make one skeptical at the outset that we'll see massive changes.
Not to mention midterms and an electoral coalition that, again, not a political point, tends not to vote during midterms. Not to mention that midterms tends to favor the party out of power broadly. So a lot of interesting dynamics, to say the least. Thank you for returning to the Bear Market Brief podcast. It has been great to have you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks again to Stephen and to you, listener, for joining. So what do you think about the state of U.S. foreign policy? How do we best tackle the challenges we face in the world? I guess that's the million-dollar question. Let us know your opinion at the X and/or Twitter handle at Bear Market Brief. The Bear Market Brief is a project of FPRI, that's the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you soon.